I'm going to start as Muslims do. Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. In the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. Now, what I want to begin off with is a very, very important point, which is that there is a massive difference between the public understanding, thank you Karen, the public understanding of Darwinian evolution and the academic understanding. So, the public understanding is, this is true. This is literally true. It's just as true as birth, death, kangaroos being halal, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's a contentious point. Maybe leave out the last point. So, that's what the public generally thinks about when they think about the word fact. Now, of course, there's a whole philosophical discussion about fact. Fact can be interpreted, it can be argued fact is maybe the best naturalistic theory we have in science, and so on and so forth. You can have other definitions. But I'm just going to be sticking to what the public thinks fact is. Okay, now, Victor Stenger, a famous physicist and also a militant atheist, he wrote this about Darwin's theory of evolution. The prospect that that evolution by natural selection, at least as a broad mechanism, will be overthrown in the future is about as likely as the prospect of finding out that someday the Earth is really flat. Just keep that in mind. Secondly, Richard Dawkins, who needs no introduction, this is what he says. Today the theory of evolution is as open to doubt as the theory that the Earth goes around the sun. Okay, so they're very clear when they are speaking about Darwinian evolution, when they are actually speaking about this theory in science, that this is true, this is certain, this is not going to change, this is absolute. This is the sort of rhetoric which is pushed out not only by popular atheists, but also in documentaries and sometimes even in schools. So fact, from that perspective, I'm going to be arguing is Darwinian evolution is not a fact. If you want to say it's the best naturalistic theory we have in science based on these assumptions, it's based on a probabilistic framework, and although it does actually have disputes, well, I don't really have a problem with that. Okay, now what is Darwinian evolution? Because a lot of people are going to say, well, I've only heard of evolution. What's Darwinian evolution? Okay, so evolution can be understood in many different ways. The most basic definition of evolution, which existed even before Darwin, which was used by his grandfather as well, Erasmus Darwin, is simply biological change over time. So you can use evolution even in a non-Darwinian sense. So evolution is simply biological change over time. And this has been written about, philosophized about, debated about for at least a couple of thousand years. Now, what is Darwinian evolution? The way that Jerry Fodor has defined it, and I kept getting, well, in my mind I was confusing Jerry Fodor with John Fodor, and in this discussion I was actually going to call him Jerry Fodor. So thankfully I just remembered that there's two different people, and he's also dead, so there's a difference between the two. So Jerry Fodor, he basically says Darwinian evolution is the twin ideas of universal common ancestry, the tree of life, and also evolution by natural selection being the mechanism for that to take place. Now, the first reason why Darwinian evolution is not a fact in the sense that it's certain, absolute, and is not going to change is because it is a valid scientific theory. Valid scientific theories aren't facts defined that way. Now, since it is a valid scientific model, theory, and paradigm, it is something which can be changed in the future. Now, science doesn't lead to this type of absolutism, this type of certainty, these types of facts, although it's there to explain facts, and we can get into that a bit later. The first reason is the problem of induction. This is an ancient problem. You have, say, a scientist who is trying to work out what color are swans, so he goes over and he views 100 swans, and he says, okay, the next swan's going to be white, or I think all swans are white. So he makes a general conclusion or a particular conclusion. Then one day he comes across, from what I remember, it was European explorers that when they came to Australia, they saw a black swan. You can say, okay, there's a black swan, so this black swan challenges my theory. So the problem of induction is one reason why scientific conclusions are never absolute. They're never written in stone. And if you pick up any book on the philosophy of science, it will say something to the effect of that scientific conclusions are not concrete, scientific conclusions are not absolute, scientific conclusions are not always certain, they are always provisional. The second issue, which is called underdetermination of scientific theory. Now, this is a basic issue that the same data can give rise to multiple interpretations, or it's hard to choose one between the two. So one way of thinking about this is, imagine you see a picture, you look at it from one angle, it looks like a vase. From another angle, it looks like two faces looking at each other. There's different ways you can explain it. There's a whole discussion about what exactly underdetermination means, but the basic point is that the same data can give rise to other scientific theories and can give rise, and it's sometimes hard to decide between the two. Now, there's a big task before a person when they claim Darwinian evolution is a fact, because essentially what they have to do is they have to explain how biochemistry, genetics, anatomy, psychology, linguistics, behavior, all of this in terms of humanity and also in terms of all of the animal kingdom and all of life can be explained via Darwin's theory of evolution. And that is actually a really, really big task. Now, Darwin's theory, there's three things about it which no one can deny. So someone can come up to you and say, 99.999% of biologists believe Darwin's theory is a valid scientific theory and it is something which is not going to change, and so on and so forth. They can try and say something like that to you. And you can simply say to them, look, those 99.999% of biologists, which of them is going to deny these three things? Firstly, that is based on a probabilistic framework. Secondly, there are assumptions involved. And thirdly, that there are disputes about those particular assumptions. Now, someone can turn around and say, well, that's true about any scientific theory. Well, we can say that's precisely the point, that it's not a fact in a literal sense, it is just another scientific theory. Now, about the probabilistic framework, I just want you to keep a figure in mind. According to a National Science Foundation in a study recently published, 99.999% of species have never been observed. We don't have their DNA, we don't have their fossils, we do not have even the most smallest fragment of their existence today. We have absolutely nothing on them. So there could have been things which were much weirder than kangaroos, much weirder than dinosaurs, much weirder than anything we've seen in any of these documentaries. But we do not have that data. So what we're actually doing is we're making an inference from 0.0001%. And considering life on this planet is estimated to be around 4 billion years old. So we're making an estimate in which we have a large set of the data missing, and we have to go back some 4 billion years. So this is actually a very daunting task. Science, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world, in an article, when it was describing the problem of trying to explain the history of life, it gave the analogy of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. So it said, to try and work out the history of life on Earth is kind of like trying to work out Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, the actual plot of it, the actual story of it, with only 13 randomly selected pages. So imagine all the rest of the pages are blank and you just have those 13 pages. It's going to be very, very difficult to actually come up with a story. I mean, if I gave a Leo Tolstoy's book to each one of you, and then I only gave you 13 pages which were filled out, and you had to come up with the rest of the plot, you'd all come up with different plots. Now, of course, scientists aren't going to sit around and say, well, there's too much data, there's this, there's that. They have decisions to make. So they're going to say, okay, we think this is the best decision we're going to make, and they have assumptions behind that. Now, I'm happy to say that I'm not promoting intelligent design, or I'm not promoting another non-naturalistic theory in science. I am saying that Darwinian evolution is a valid naturalistic theory in science. But we must keep in mind that since it already assumes naturalism from the beginning, its results are always going to be going through those filters, and that we're going to speak about roughly near the end. By the way, is anyone keeping count? Could you give me how much? 10 minutes, fantastic. Okay, so there are assumptions involved when it comes to Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, some of these assumptions are the gene-centered view, which was made famous by Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. Genes are transferred vertically. Gradualism, which is a very important one. And mutations are random. Also, that acquired characteristics are not inherited. So each one of these assumptions is actually challenged by other evolutionary biologists. Now, someone may say, well, they're fringe. Someone may say, well, this particular assumption, we fixed it by another assumption. That's besides the point. The point is, when the public is told about this theory, we're told, like, okay, it's a fact, it's true, you're a complete moron if you actually deny it. But we can actually see it has assumptions, and some of these assumptions are being challenged. So the gene-centered view is being challenged by, say, group selection. We know about horizontal gene transfer now. Gradualism, which is very, very important, because Charles Darwin, he wanted to take gradualism as an assumption. He had gradualism as an assumption, and Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog, he wanted to take out gradualism as an assumption in the theory, and because he thought that this is very risky and this is going to put the theory in jeopardy. And Darwin said, no, I'm not going to get rid of this assumption. He did not want to get rid of the assumption of gradualism. Okay, mutations are random. This is obviously postmodern synthesis, that mutations are actually random. This has also been challenged. I'm going to a little bit about that later. Acquired characteristics are not inherited. So characteristics that you acquire in your life, they were thought by the proponents of neo-Darwinism that you cannot actually inherit them, when you actually can inherit them. Now I'm going to give you what Dennis Noble says about this, and he's a professor at Oxford University. Is not, and by the way, any of the people I'm quoting, they're not religious in any way. They are outright naturalists. They believe in naturalism, and they believe in, they're not challenging it from a religious perspective at all. He says, all the central assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproven. Now, you may turn around and say, well, that professor's wrong because my professor says they have been verified. Well, that doesn't really matter. All I'm trying to say is, there are assumptions, some people are challenging them, although they may be fringe, and other people are accepting them. Okay, disputes. Now this is very important. Charles Darwin, in his book in 1859, he proposed that natural selection was the main mechanism driving evolutionary change. In 2016, there was a discussion at the Royal Society meeting in London in which evolutionary biologists from across the world came together, and the very question they were asking, and some of the biologists were saying, Darwin was wrong, other biologists were saying, no, he was right. They were discussing whether natural selection actually works. Some of them were like, wait, this is getting a bit unholy for us, right? Others were like, no, we need to actually look at other mechanisms, and they're going back and forth. Now, I just want you to keep in mind, if you studied biology at school, or if you saw any documentaries of David Attenborough or whatever, you'd be shocked. You'd be like, what? All our life we've been hearing, natural selection did this, natural selection did that, natural selection can pay your taxes. And now we're being told, actually, natural selection is maybe perhaps not the best mechanism, and it's being challenged by alternatives. And that should make you think about the difference between the public and the academic understanding between the two. Now, a quick thing about some of the alternatives which are pushed. Now, these alternatives are the alternatives of the mechanism of Darwin's mechanism, not the actual history, universal common ancestry. So these guys still believe in universal common ancestry, but I'm going to explain the link between the two later. So evolution by natural genetic engineering, which is proposed by James Shapiro, which proposes external factors activate genome change operators. In other words, mutations are not random, but they're actually directed. Neo-Lamarckian evolution. So if you remember, Lamarck, the guy who existed around 50 years before Darwin, he had his own history of life, which was different to the tree of life. He had like multiple origins and multiple lines of parallel evolution, and he had a different mechanism which involved the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Well, this neo-Lamarckian evolution is actually making a comeback now. Now, these proponents, they challenge the assumption of gradualism, and there's actually a lot of discussion about this at the moment. Now, a third alternative, which is post-Darwin, but it died out and then it made a sort of resurrection again, is a sort of Mendelian mutationism, also known as mutation-driven evolution, which again challenges the idea of gradualism. It argues evolution takes place in rapid steps by large mutations. Now, if Darwin's theory of evolution, if his theory of natural selection was a fact, then these alternatives, these scientists who challenge it in the universities actually publish papers with evidence that goes against the actual theory wouldn't actually exist, but clearly they actually do. Now, there's a project known as the Third Way of Evolution, which is a bunch of evolutionary biologists who come together and they try to challenge basically Darwin's theory of evolution, and they try to put forward other alternatives in terms of the mechanism. And these people, they're from all over the world. They're from China, they're from North America, they're from Europe, they're from universities like Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, MIT. And these guys aren't challenging Darwin because they have some sort of religious agenda. They're challenging Darwin because they think he was actually wrong. So you were saying something? 5 minutes, okay, sorry. I thought you were saying something to me. Okay, so the last thing, and I want to focus on this, because what I believe in is, although we believe in science, although we believe in reason, we believe in these things, there's something which is very, very powerful as a sort of test, right? So if someone comes along and says, look, I believe Darwin's theory of natural selection, I believe it to be true, literally, like it's true. We can do a sort of test. We can say, okay, does your human behavior actually reflect that? Do you actually spend your time just worrying about survival and reproduction? Are there things that you do in your life which are that are for non-survival reasons, reproductive reasons? And I was happy to see that John Fodor described himself as an effective altruist. He believes in effective altruism. So that's the idea, that basically that we want to help people as much as possible, not based on our passions, but rather based on how many people we can help based upon the resources that we have. Something like this, right? So I want to know, how does that make any sense from a Darwinian point of view? Just test that on yourself. Do you actually want to help people as an end in of itself? Because if you want to do that, that's non-Darwinian behavior. But if you want to help people out of a selfish reason, then that's not really altruistic. So where do you actually lie? Now, the last issue is between methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. So methodological naturalism is the idea, look, whenever we study something in nature, we're going to look at natural causes, natural effects. Now, the scientific method goes back to Hassan ibn Haytham about 1,000 years ago, and he believed in methodological naturalism. So there's nothing wrong with subscribing to methodological naturalism, nothing at all. But the confusion lies when you begin off as a philosophical naturalist, you believe nature is all that there is, and then when you're working within science and you're working within the paradigm of methodological naturalism, you take his conclusions to be literally true. And the issue really here is that if there isn't a God, then something like a Darwinian history of life has to be true as a matter of logic. I just want you to keep that in mind. If there isn't a God, then something like the Darwinian history of life has to be true as a matter of logic. Now, if that's the case, then what starts to happen is that your beliefs start to impact the way that you actually do science. And just consider the statement by Richard Dawkins in the book The Blind Watchmaker. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist, right? So if you're intellectually satisfied by a scientific theory, of course you're going to be biased towards that theory, and there's going to be a whole bunch of issues there. Okay, now, Michael Roos, who's an atheist philosopher of science, he's written a book called Darwinism as Religion. And this is a very, 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 very interesting book. And in it, he basically argues, look, although it's a valid science, it is also a religion. And what he says is this: I shall argue in the way that evolution tries to speak about the nature of humans and their place in the scheme of things. We have a religion, or if you want to speak about it a little bit more cautiously, a secular religious perspective. Again, Julian Huxley, another atheist evolutionary biologist. He wrote a book called Religion Without Revelation, in which he believed evolutionary humanism was a new form of religion. And here's what he said: 20th century man, it is clear, needs an organ for dealing with destiny, a new system of religious beliefs and attitudes adapted to a new situation in which his societies now have to exist. So these authors, and these are people who, they are vocal about what they actually believe. They are clear. There is something within their own atheist philosophy which is making them see Darwin's theory as more than just a theory. And this isn't just from them. This is from actually people who don't believe in Darwin's theory, such as Masato Shinai, who proposed the new mutation-driven evolution, and he calls Darwin's theory, he says, look, Darwin is a god in evolution. You cannot challenge him, and his theory has actually become dogmatic. So as I'm running out of time, just to summarize, A fact is certain, a fact doesn't change, a fact is absolute. Darwin's theory is a valid theory model paradigm, but it is not a fact. It is actually just a scientific theory like the rest of scientific theories. Anything good I have said in this presentation is from God. Every mistake is from my own. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to come here and talk about this important issue. If I can be so bold, I'm curious, could I get a show of hands as to anyone here, or how many people here think that evolution is a fact or is probably a fact? Anyone apart from? Okay, so we've got a few people. Okay, but I do seem to have my work cut out for me, but that's all right. I'm happy for a challenge. So I'm not actually really here to sort of, persuade everyone here that Darwinian evolution is a fact. That's not really the main point, although I do think it is a fact. Really, my prime goal is to try to help you guys to maybe look at these sorts of philosophical and scientific issues in a bit of a different way, and sort of think through these issues for yourself. So hopefully you'll find my remarks somewhat useful in that respect. So the way I'm going to structure my presentation this evening is I'm going to start with some brief philosophical background as to the meaning of facts and certainty and scientific theories, and then I'm going to discuss some of the major lines of scientific evidence in favour of Darwinian evolution, in particular genetics, comparative morphology, biogeography and the fossil evidence. So let me start by talking a little bit about some of the philosophical background. So this debate is asking about, is Darwinian evolution a fact? Well, what do we mean by a fact, right? We might think that we know what a fact is, it's just a fact. But it turns out, like a lot of things, that philosophers don't exactly agree as to what is meant by as to what we mean by a fact. So there are two main theories about what a fact is. One is that it's just a true proposition, right? So a proposition is just some assertion that I make about the way something is. So, my name is James, for example, not Jerry. That's a proposition. The other main theory, and so a true proposition would just be a fact. The other main theory about facts is that there's some sort of state of affairs or the way things are in the world. So that's a little bit different to sort of a statement about the way things are. It's just sort of the thing that exists. But whichever of these theories you prefer, I don't think it's true, and this is one point where I disagree with Subboor. I don't agree that facts are certain. I think that's a bit of a confusion, because certain is a word that a property that applies to our beliefs about things. We can be more or less certain or uncertain about something, but a fact itself or a true proposition, a state of affairs, they're not certain, that they just are, right? So we can be certain or uncertain that something is a fact, but the fact itself isn't certain. I think that that's a bit of a confusion. And related to that point, I don't think that we do need to be 100% completely certain, that is no possibility of doubt, in order to assert that something is a fact. I think that we do that all the time when we talk about, facts in history and in science and in everyday life. We're not always completely 100% without doubt when we talk about something being a fact. And so I don't think that's actually necessary in order to assert that something's a fact. You just have to have a sufficiently high level of evidence, I think. Now, moving on to scientific theories. A scientific theory is not just a big long list of facts. It's a research methodology. It's a way of approaching a particular question. It's incomplete. It will change over time. And Subboor sort of emphasised this to some degree. I think that's absolutely correct. Also, importantly, a scientific theory is a framework that helps to account for, to explain a wide range of different observations. And that's critical. We'll be coming back to that on a number of occasions. So, understood in this way, I don't think it's right to say that the theory of evolution is a fact or it's identical to a set of facts. I think that's a bit of a mistake. A scientific theory and facts are sort of different things. But what I would say, and this is just sort of clarifying what I'm arguing a little bit, is that the key findings, the key implications, the key results of evolutionary theory, those are facts. And that doesn't mean that I believe that they are 100% certain, but I believe that we have by far sufficient evidence to assert that they are facts. In particular, I'll be focusing on common descent is a fact, and the critical role of natural selection in bringing about changes over time is also a fact, with near but not complete certainty. Okay, and I think I'll skip that slide because that's basically what I just said. A key point that I want to get across is that the reason we accept the claims made by scientific theories is because fundamentally of their ability to account for a wide range of observations. So I have an example here in the case of heliocentrism, the theory that the sun is at the center of the solar system and the Earth revolves around it, along with the other planets. Now, there are a number of observations that have been made in centuries past, generally, when these were first made, including from left to right here, so stellar aberration, that's a sort of change in the relative angle of sunlight. There's an analogy there to rain. I won't go into the details of that, that's not really important. There's the stellar parallax, the apparent change in position of distant stars as the Earth at different times of year. There's also the changing phases of Venus. The details of these aren't important. The point is simply that these are some of the sets of observations that can be accounted for, that can be explained. We can say why they happen by the theory of heliocentrism. And it's these sorts of observations, the ability to explain, to account for them, to give an explanation that gives us justification for saying, yes, the sun is in fact at the center of the solar system and the Earth revolves around it. Now, my argument is it's just like that for evolution. We have a wide body of observations, fossil, genetic, and so on, that I'm about to describe. And it's in virtue of the ability to explain these observations and give an account as to why they are that way that gives us justification to accept Darwinian evolution as fact. Not with 100% certainty, but with very high levels of confidence. Okay. So that concludes the sort of philosophical preamble. And now I want to get into talking about the actual scientific evidence in favor of Darwinian evolution. Specifically, I'm going to focus mostly on evidence in favor of common descent. This is the idea that all life forms, or at least all animals and plants and so on, derive from a single common ancestor billions of years in the past. And so there are four main categories of evidence that I want to talk about: genetic evidence, comparative anatomy, fossil record, and biogeography. So let's take the genetic evidence first. So the genetic code. The genetic code describes a relationship between sequences of three nucleic acids. So these are the sort of bits along the DNA. Bits along the DNA code, basically, that describe who we are. There's a relationship between each three of these nucleic acids and one particular amino acid that it codes for. You can see that they're described in this diagram here. This code, with some minor small exceptions here and there, is universal throughout all forms of life, from bacteria right up through to humans. And the basic machinery, the cellular machinery and so on, that supports it is also ubiquitous with minor variations, but it's effectively the same everywhere. Now, the Darwinian evolution gives us an explanation as to why this is the case, because this evolved very, very early in the development of life, and all subsequent organisms have inherited this with only very minor modifications. So it's a natural way of explaining it through Darwinian mechanism. Another piece of evidence comes from more targeted analysis of the genetic differences between particular types of animals. So that those can be used by identifying where they differ and where they're the same in terms of differences in genes to construct what are called phylogenetic trees, one of which is for a subset of mammals is shown here. Details aren't super important. What I just wanted to emphasize is that what we find when we do this is a very close relationship between the basic morphology of the animals, so what they look like and how they behave and so on at a sort of gross anatomical level, and their genetic relationship. And this holds even when we look at, so I did have part of the quote bolded here before, it seems to have disappeared. This holds even when we look at parts of the genome that themselves are not directly functional. So that's what this particular study that I've quoted here did. They looked at essentially for random insertions into bits of the genome that themselves don't do anything and occur randomly. So there's no real reason why these should be the same in different animals, unless those animals have inherited the same random insertions from a common ancestor. And so this sort of thing we find ubiquitous throughout life, that the relationship between what the animal looks like and the genetic relationships to each other. Another interesting example from genetics comes from the human chromosome 2, which is shown here. Now, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, whereas all the other great apes have 24. The reason we have one less is because two of our chromosomes, in an ancestor that split off between us and the other great apes several million years ago, merged to form a single chromosome. And we can see this because there is the DNA, this is sort of representation of the genetic sequence in the different chromosomes is basically the same across human chromosome 2 as in these sort of two halves of the chromosome in chimps, gorillas and orangutans. There's obviously some differences because they're different species, but it's very, very similar. It's just that in the human case it's on the one chromosome, and in the other cases it's split into two. We can even see remnants of the fusion point and the remnant centromere, which is like a bit of the chromosome that sort of keeps it together in the middle, on the human chromosome 2 from where it used to be a separate chromosome. And again, it's very hard to see why we would observe something like this unless there was an actual ancestor that we share with chimps and gorillas and so on that had those separate chromosomes which subsequently merged. Okay, so that's some genetic evidence. Let's look at some comparative anatomy. So what we find when we look across the animal kingdom is a wide range of structures that bear sort of basic similarities, but with some differences and changes depending on the particular adaptations or environments of the animals in question. So a good example of this is the pentadactyl limb. That just means like the five-fingered limb, right? So there's a basic structure in terms of the arrangement of the bones and the number of them, but then is found to be adapted upon in terms of the change of the relative sizes and shape of the bones across a wide range of mammals, from bats, dolphins, moles and human beings. Again, Darwinian evolution provides a clear reason as to why we would see something like this, because all of these creatures have inherited the same basic structure from a common ancestor, but has subsequently been adapted according to the particular selective pressures acting on that species. Yes. Another example from comparative anatomy is what are termed atavisms. So these are old traits that used to be expressed in a previous species that are now no longer generally expressed in an organism, but the organism retains the genes for them, and so under unusual circumstances they can become re-expressed. So in this paper, basically what scientists did is they induced the expression of genes for the formation of tooth buds in a hen. So, birds don't normally have teeth, but they do have the genes for them, or at least some of the genes for forming teeth. And these scientists were able to sort of produce these, it's a bit hard to see there, but you can see these sort of bumps, which are sort of the tooth buds, by triggering the expression of these genes that are still there, but normally dormant. We see a similar thing in the case of snakes' legs, which have been reported, either sort of the leg buds or sort of more fully formed legs here, because again, snakes generally don't have legs, but their ancestors did, so they retain some of the genes for forming them, and under unusual circumstances, they can be re-expressed. We see a similar phenomenon called vestigial structures. There's many examples. This is just one in the baleen whale, where it has this it has the sort of pelvic girdle bone here, which is not actually attached to any other bones in the skeleton, and it doesn't do anything. It's just there because it's vestigial from its ancestors, which had a functional hind limb. And sometimes you actually see hind limb bones found. These have been reported in the literature, where this would be an atavism, because they're not normally seen, but sometimes they have been found. So all of these atavisms and vestigial structures, again, are well accounted for by the idea that these animals share genetic material from ancestors, which is now no longer used because of their new habitats, but can be re-expressed under the right circumstances. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about the fossil record. Fossils are basically just remnants or traces of organisms that are found usually in stone. And they're generally the product of sort of fairly rare circumstances where an organism is buried rapidly before it can decay, and then some sort of mineralization process occurs in which the soft tissue is replaced with some sort of rock or other mineral, and a sort of permanent record is preserved. Now, there's a wide variety of properties of the fossil record which are best explained through the theory of Darwinian evolution. So, one of the main features of the fossil record is that we see transitional forms. So a transitional form is somewhat of a vague concept, but the basic idea is that you have an ancestral creature which had a certain number of traits and a more modern, recent creature which has a bunch of different traits. So according to Darwinian evolution, what we would expect to see is somewhere in the fossil record between the time when the older creature lived and when the modern creature lived, we would see transitional forms that have some of the traits of the modern creature, but some of the traits of the older creature as it sort of transitions through the evolutionary stage. And there are many, many examples of such things found in the fossil record. Australopithecus is one example from the case of human evolution. So you can see from these diagrams here, here's the Australopithecus pelvis and leg bones. They very closely resemble those of a human and very distinctly different from those of the ape. You can see the elongation of the pelvis is much reduced and the orientation of the legs is very different. This is consistent with the Australopithecus, which is believed to have walked upright. However, if you look at the skull of the Australopithecus, it has many of the features of a chimpanzee, including the prominent eye ridges and the protruding jaw, and is very different to a Homo sapiens skull. So in the case of Australopithecus, we have some features like the legs of a human, but other features like the skull shape of our other ape ancestors. So did I have 20 minutes? Is there? Yeah, that was counting from 15, wasn't it? Yeah, sorry. So there's 5. Yeah. Sorry about that. We see similar transitional forms in the evolution of the horse. You can see the gradual sort of merging together. Sorry, it actually up is more recent. The gradual merging together and reduction in size of the extra toes down to the sort of the single toe there. Similarly, in the evolution of the whale, where we have a progression of forms with the gradual reduction in the size of the limbs and the shape of the body for an aquatic life. There's also a strong concordance between the fossil record and genetic evidence, so the phylogenetic trees that I mentioned before. These are just a couple of papers. I don't have time to go into the details of that, but of course they're not a perfect match for each other. The fossil record has gaps in it, and there are complexities in it, as Subboor has mentioned a few of these, so I'm not going to pretend that it's all perfect, but there is in general a strong concordance between these, so that the order we expect things to appear based on phylogeny, based on a analysis of the genetics, is in fact the order we find things in the fossil record. We don't find things all mixed up higgledy-piggledy in human fossils next to dinosaurs. That's not what we see. And that observation is exactly what we'd expect given the theory of evolution, a structured ordering to the fossil record. Now, moving to the final line of evidence that I wanted to present, which is biogeography. This essentially refers to the study of the habitats and places where animals and other species are found over the world. Biogeography likewise shows a clear structure in where animals and plants live. It's not just dependent, obviously it depends partly on like the climate and the weather and so on, and what habitats are available, but that's not the only factor that influences where you find different creatures. Cacti, for example, are, with the exception of one species that's thought to have been transferred by possibly European ships, cacti are only found in the Americas. They're not found like in the Sahara, even though the environment is pretty similar. We have many examples of this sort of thing from evolution, where I think I'm going to jump to this one actually, where we find a spatial structuring of the location of where organisms live, and marsupials are a great example of this. Marsupials are only found in South America and Australia. And Papua New Guinea, but basically South America and Australia, that seems a bit of an odd thing, right? Why just those two places? Well, the answer, if we look back, is that at the time when marsupials evolved, South America and Australia were close to each other. They were connected in the larger supercontinent, sort of via a bridge through Antarctica. And a comparison of the morphology and also the genetics of different marsupial species shows a clear relationship between where they live and sort of the relative distance between where they would have been, or where the ancestors of these species would have been at this time when they sort of emerged from each other. These days, of course, South America and Australia have moved far apart, and Antarctica doesn't have a habitat suitable for really anything much living in it, so we don't find anything there. There are some marsupial fossils that have been found in Antarctica, though. But the point is that this sort of distribution is best explained by Darwinian evolution. Because this is the sort of constraints that you would expect to see on where animals can be. They don't just sort of pop up anywhere. They arise in particular circumstances in particular locations and sort of spread out to where they can reach to. And that's a similar point that the oceanic islands brings up, that the ecosystems of oceanic islands, these are islands that have never been attached to the mainland, that they generally volcanic islands that appear in the middle of the ocean. The ecosystems are very different there. The only organisms that you've non-introduced by man, obviously non-introduced organisms that you find there are those whose ancestors would have had some way of getting there from the mainland, like bats, for example, or certain types of flying insects, plants whose pollen could have been blown over by the winds and so on. You don't see like large land mammals there because there was no opportunity for them to get there. Okay, so that concludes the basic remarks I wanted to make, illustrating just some, and I emphasize that this is just a small taste of the evidences that support Darwinian evolution. Now, the way I framed this in terms of my initial philosophical remarks is that this is a wide range of observations. What I've shown you is things that we observe in terms of the pattern of species distributions or genetic markers and morphology, things like that. We observe these things. How can we account for all these things? Why are they like that? Well, I've argued that Darwinian evolution gives us a consistent and coherent explanation for why all these observations are the way they are. It explains a wide range of phenomena. Unless we just accept it as all a big coincidence and throw up our hands and say, well, I don't know why they're all like that, we are driven to ask why they are like that. Darwinian evolution provides an explanation. So just as other scientific theories, like heliocentrism, I argued, provide us with an explanation for a wide range of observational phenomenon, and on that basis we accept them as factual, as true. Likewise, I argue that we should accept Darwinian evolution as true, as factual, on the basis of its profound explanatory abilities to account for this wide range of observational phenomenon. And again, I'm not asserting that it's 100% certain, but I'm arguing that there is more than enough evidence to assert that Darwinian evolution is a fact. Thank you very much.
Okay, Bismillah, in the name of God. So there's quite a few contentions that John Fodor, I have to keep reminding myself, John Fodor actually put up, and I've got them all listed here. James. So there's lots of contentions that he put out, and what I've done is I've just put them down, and I'm going to try and go through them as quickly as possible. So it's going to take maybe a little bit longer than 10 minutes, but hopefully that should be fine with you guys. So the first thing he said is it leads to factual knowledge and it has explanatory power. Now, we need to be a bit careful here when we're speaking about explanatory power. What does it mean to explain? Now, when it comes to an explanation of the observations that we actually have, when someone says we've explained it, this can create a sort of image in your head. So for example, you're playing Cluedo, you're like, okay, so we've got this clue, this clue, this clue, this clue, and okay, I think the butler did it. Okay, let's check the butler did it. Okay, we have an explanation, the butler actually did it. We have the smoking gun. That's not the same case in science. That's not actually the way it actually takes place. Because in science, you have the same set of data that can give rise to multiple interpretations, and you can always have, like I mentioned before, the problem of induction, where you get a new piece of data which doesn't agree with your previous theory. Now, when it comes to, for example, John mentioned common ancestry. James mentioned common ancestry. I'm actually going to write it here in bold. Sorry, just give me a sec, James. You can't blame me. I landed after some 27-hour flight this morning, and I haven't, jet lag. That's the excuse, not incompetence. Okay, James. So, what was I saying? Yes, explanation. So an explanation about the data in terms of the observation. So it sounds like, okay, so this is an explanation, we've got it, we've actually understood it. Okay, that's not the case with universal common ancestry. And it's very important to understand. Universal common ancestry, firstly, is based upon the assumption of naturalism. Naturalism, like I mentioned before, you must have natural causation, natural causes, natural effects when you're actually trying to explain something. Secondly, you also have the assumption that there is a mechanism that makes a change from this to that. Without that mechanism, you can't actually say this led to that. Now, what's important here to note is this. In James's presentation, everyone give me a thumbs up, I said his name right. So in James's presentation, there was no mention of natural selection. There was no mention at all. And that's telling, because that's what Darwin's theory is about. Darwinian evolution is defined as evolution by natural selection, which is there to explain, which is there coupled with universal common ancestry. Those are the twin ideas. But he didn't mention anything about natural selection. Now, why it's important to actually have explain natural selection and explain how natural selection is powerful is because if you have an image of a tree or you have an image of a hedge like Lamarck or whatever, you must show a mechanism. You can't just say this happened, you must show how it actually happened. Now, James can actually say, do you know what, guys? It doesn't matter. If we don't have natural selection, we may have another mechanism. Okay, that's fine, but that shows Darwinian evolution is not a fact because natural selection is Darwin's main idea. So we have naturalism as an assumption. We also have the assumption of a mechanism. Apart from that, when it is said it explains the data, there is also another assumption of homology, which is the assumption that similarities is due to common descent. This is an assumption. Now, if James said, okay, this particular part of the human being, this particular part of the chimpanzee, they seem similar, so I'm going to assume homology. Well, there's no problem there. If another evolutionary biologist said, this thing is similar to this thing, so I'm assuming homology, again, it's not a problem there. But if you say similarity, similarities, so similarities are due to common descent, that's an assumption. Similarities exist, therefore similarities are due to common descent. That's actually circular reasoning. You can't have that as a conclusion and also have that as an assumption. You can say it's an assumption and you can leave it there. You can say that's fine. So when it comes to chromosome 2, it comes to anything else, you say, okay, we're going to assume homology, that's fine. But if you're then going to make the inference, upon the inference, that's actually going to be circular reasoning. And we can go more about that in the cross sort of discussion. Okay, apart from that assumption, we also have the assumption of a single origin, that there was one single origin from which we have the tree of life. So we have at least 4 assumptions when it is said, this is an explanation, this is an explanation. Now, James is actually from a physics background, so I didn't expect him to say that the observations, they fit Darwin's theory and just leave it there, because he knows from a physics background about the revolutionary change that happened between the Newtonian model of the universe and the Einsteinian model of the universe. Now, at that particular time, Newton had an explanation, and that explanation assumed that time and space was fixed, and I'm sure James knows more about that. So, in terms of this explanation, Einstein came along and he completely reversed it. He showed time and space is like fabric, it is changing, and also just completely flipped our view on gravity. So the idea that it has great explanatory power and that it explains the facts and just leaving it there, I don't think that's enough. We need to actually look at the history of science and see how ideas can actually be changed. Now, like I mentioned, any philosophy of science book, it would say something like this. This is what it says in Philosophy of Science, a very short introduction by Oxford University. Historically, there are many cases of theories that we now believe to be false, but that were empirically quite successful. This isn't a fringe view. This is a view which is understood by philosophers. Now, James is actually, unless he's changed his view, from what I read about him, he's actually an instrumentalist. So he actually believes the scientific method is an instrument. It's a methodology of actually studying the world. But from my understanding, he's not a scientific realist. He doesn't believe that leads to, that is the information that you're actually getting is actually the way the world actually is. Maybe you can clarify about that. Whether he is or he isn't, the main point is the problem of induction is still there. The problem of underdetermination of scientific theory by evidence is still there. And the assumptions in terms of that explanation are still there. Okay. So apart from that, what's important to understand is, like I mentioned before, the difference between the public understanding and the academic understanding is that the public understanding is basically this: similarity, similarity, common descent. That's just generally the way that we were taught in documentaries or on TV or social media or whatever. But if you actually look at the academic way that this is actually discussed, this is actually not correct. So for example, Jonathan Marks, who's an atheist evolutionary biologist, in his book, What It Means to Be 98% Chimpanzee, he puts it this way. Sameness, otherness is a philosophical paradox that is resolved by argument, not by data. Genetic data tells us precisely what we know already, that humans are both very similar and very different from the great apes. And likewise, the philosopher of biology, Elliot Sober, another atheist, here's what he says in his book, Evidence and Evolution, The Logic Behind the Science. Both of the following thoughts are naive. Humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have arisen independently because they are so different. There is no must within a probabilistic framework. And both of these authors actually do believe human-chimp ancestry is true, literally. But they're just being candid about what the data is saying. Now, another thing that James said, which is incorrect, is in terms of genetic data, and saying that genetic data fits, when we actually studied it, and it fits with the fossil record and everything seems okay. Of course, he said, okay, there may be some issues here, but there's not some issues, there's actually major issues here. So for example, before there was a discrepancy between the morphological data and the morphological data. Then the molecular biologists came and they gave the molecular data which contradicted the morphological data. And then the molecular data contradicted the molecular data. And one piece of one paper which was recently published, Molecular Phylogenetics and the Perennial Problem of Homology by Ford, Doolittle, and Andrew Inkpen, this is exactly the problem that they go on about. So, it's very important, just to summarize that section, that it's not enough to say similarity, similarity, therefore common descent. If you just want to leave it as an assumption, that's fine, but then you have to say that this explanation has this assumption, but also has those other three assumptions I mentioned earlier. Also, this is very, very important. If James is not going to defend natural selection or say that we don't need natural selection as a mechanism or we can replace it by another mechanism or whatever, then what's the point of Darwin? Because that's what Darwin came up with. The idea of universal common ancestry was there and it was known before Darwin. In fact, it goes back approximately 3,000 years to ancient Hindu philosophers who came up with the idea of tree of life in human chimpancestry based on the assumption of homology. And they needed a mechanism. You can't just say we actually have this as a, we have this as an assumption and that's basically it. You actually have to defend some sort of mechanism. And it's like a bridge. So you have the road and you actually have the structure. Now, if you break the mechanism, you break the connection between the two. It's not enough to point out at small evolutionary changes and make an extrapolation to everything else and say, okay, look, clearly this vestigial organ exists or this particular thing exists, therefore, this tree of life is true. No, you actually can't do that. Okay, apart from that, when we're speaking about homology, we also have to understand there is the problem of homoplasy, which is similarities at a biochemical, genetic, anatomical level, which are not due to common ancestry. And this is well known and understood. James also mentioned vestigial organs. Okay, another very important point is vestigial organs are not exempt from the problem of induction or not exempt from underdetermination of scientific theory by evidence. A prime example of that is junk DNA. Junk DNA is something which militant atheists held on to and they were like, look, it's junk, therefore common ancestry. And here's what the atheist Philip Kitcher, the philosopher, said. A lot of DNA in there is not needed, it's junk. If it's intelligently designed, then God needs to go back to school. Well, actually, no, Philip Kitcher needs to go back to understanding the philosophy of science. Even if all the data, according to his limited mindset at that point, made it seem like common ancestry is true, he should have understood problem of induction's there, problem of underdetermination of scientific theory by evidence is there. Therefore, I should say that this conclusion is provisional. He didn't do that, he jumped the gun. And in 2012 and onwards, ENCODE, the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, they have been publishing studies which actually show that majority of what we thought was junk is actually no longer junk. So if we are going to make conclusions based upon some evidence that we actually have, let's not hide the assumptions. Let's not hide the fact that these are also prone to change due to the problem of induction and problem of underdetermination of scientific theory by evidence. And also, let's not forget, we're here to defend Darwin because it's about Darwinian evolution. So let's mention natural selection and let's start by actually explaining why this mechanism in the public light has always been taught to be true, but from the academic level, we don't see it as that. And since that's what I began off with Richard Dawkins and Victor Stenger saying that it is a fact, it's like the shape of the earth, then if James doesn't believe that that is the case, then I want to know how is he going to also help me in showing the difference between the public understanding and also the academic understanding. Everything good I've said is from God, every mistake is my own.
So thanks everyone. Honestly, I'm not too fussed with what you call me. I mean, that guy or him is fine, or hey you, that's not really the key issue here. Okay, so there's a number of issues that Subboor has raised and I've raised that I wanted to sort of touch on in my rebuttal remarks. So first I wanted to, or just a quick mention about the difference between the public and the academic understanding of evolution. Now I'm happy to agree that there's a wide divergence here, really across the spectrum from people who think that evolution says that humans evolved from monkeys, to people who think that evolution is just a fact and we can go to sleep and never think about it again, which I'm not advocating. This is the case for almost all scientific theory. So yeah, the public understanding of evolution is not very good. We should try to do something about this. Hopefully this event helps that a little bit. So I'm in complete agreement there. Let me now move to talking about another one of the key issues which has come up, which is really more of a fundamental philosophy of science question. This relates to what Subboor was saying about underdetermination, the problem of induction, and also whether we interpret scientific theories like realistically in terms of that they're actually describing the way the reality is. As opposed to just sort of being useful or instrumental is the term he used. These days I lean more towards a realist view, which says that scientific theories actually do describe the way reality is in some sense, but you know, my own views in that are a little bit, well, sort of beyond the scope of the debate. But I think that there's an important thing to realise here, that philosophers of science do disagree about how to best understand the relationship between scientific theories and truth or reality. So there are people who think that on the basis of things like underdetermination or the problem of induction or various arguments for anti-realism, that we shouldn't see really any scientific theories as describing the way reality truly is. Yeah, that sort of controversy is far beyond what I can really address this evening. All I'm really going to say is I'm not exactly sure where Subboor himself sits on this. I think what you can do is say, yeah, you know, scientific theories as a whole, they don't really describe reality, or at least we can't know if they do. So they just sort of, scientists do their own thing, and they might be useful, but it's not necessarily, you know, arriving at truth. That's one view you can hold. What I don't, so you can do that. I think that's legitimate. What I don't think you can do is apply that logic to just the Darwinian theory of evolution and not to other scientific theories as well. So that would include, you know, heliocentrism as an example that I gave, or you know, atomic theory, quantum physics, theory of relativity, germ theory of disease, plate tectonics, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure, and it doesn't even necessarily matter exactly what Subboor himself thinks. I just want to emphasize here that you can present sort of meta-level arguments against believing that evolution describes true facts, but there's sort of a cost to that. It means you have to deny that science or scientific theories really describes reality at all. And personally, I think that there's powerful philosophical objections to this. It leaves you to, well, like, how is it that we're able to, you know, put men on the moon and design these complicated electronic devices which are based on an understanding of electromagnetism and quantum theory and all sorts of other stuff? Like, how do we do that if we don't actually somehow know something about the way reality is really working? Is it still just some coincidence? Of course, there's rebuttals to that, and we could go on and on. I just want to sort of flag that as a debate and say, in my opinion, there's arguments to interpret scientific theories literally, or at least sort of realistically to some degree, but that is an open debate. That's not really a scientific debate, though. It's more a philosophy of science debate. I mean, they're not completely independent, but... Okay, now let me move on to another issue which Subboor has raised, which is to do with evolution having assumptions. And he's mentioned this in a number of occasions and contexts. So, in my opinion, this exhibits something of a confusion, or perhaps we're talking past each other to some degree, but let me at least try to explain how I see it. So, yes, every scientific theory ever has assumptions. Every time a scientist does anything, they start with assumptions. You can't just sort of turn up in the lab or in a theory, you know, computer, as I do things, and just sort of work your magic starting from nowhere. Like, that doesn't work in any discipline, and it certainly doesn't work in science. You always start with assumptions. But that doesn't mean that you're just cooking things up from thin air. The question is, you start with assumptions and you say, okay, so I'm going to say, I'm going to develop a theory based on these assumptions that says X, Y, and Z. Your theory will generally make predictions, or at the very least, it will say some things that you can then examine from a new angle. Well, is my theory of, say, how a certain trait evolved, to take an evolutionary related example, is that consistent with the fossil record? Is it consistent with what I know about how, I don't know, the relevant geographical constraints are in terms of the environment that the organisms live in? Is it consistent with what we know in terms of genetic mechanisms? Does it make any predictions that we could then go and test? How consistent are my assumptions with assumptions that scientists make in other areas or when they're studying other organisms? You know, and of course the details sort of increase exponentially there in terms of what you can look at. The point is, assumptions have implications and they can be tested. We can see how reasonable our assumptions are. We can also see what our assumptions do for us. If we make some assumptions and construct a model and it doesn't really tell us anything, then they're lousy assumptions. It didn't help us. We haven't learned anything. The point about a good set of assumptions is that they'll lead to a theory which is widely explanatory. And this is the point that I was making. If your assumptions lead to a theory that's widely explanatory, that's a reason to accept your assumptions. The more you can explain, the more you can account for, the more you can give reasons and mechanisms and causal explanations as to how they came to be, the more evidence you have in favour of your theory. Of your theory and your assumptions. So it's not about not having assumptions, it's about validating those assumptions through testing and through what you can account for. Good scientific theories will do that and be able to explain a whole range of things repeatedly in many different areas, and that's what I argue Darwinian evolution has done. A word on the mechanism of natural selection is in order, because it's true, although I think I did mention it briefly, not by name, but I mentioned the concept a few times. I focused mainly on common descent in my initial remarks. Now, this was a deliberate decision because I had less than 20 minutes given. I had to talk about some philosophy to try to outline, like 150 years of scientific research on this massive topic. So I had to narrow it down a little bit. So I focused on one half of the question, which was the common descent. The other main half was the natural selection. I agree they go together. I do think, however, that you can establish common descent without, or at least major or significant reference to natural selection. It's certainly not as strong, but you can present arguments to show, for example, the universal genetic code. I think that is very strong evidence in favour of common descent, because it's hard to see why else all of the organisms would share the same fundamental building blocks of producing proteins from DNA and so on, and almost exactly the same coding between nucleic and amino acids, unless they derived that from a common ancestor. And of course, I could multiply all the examples that I gave previously. I think a lot of those things can be established independently of the mechanism that brought them about, be it natural selection, or be it sexual selection, or even be it different mechanisms that some people have proposed. So yes, I was selective. I focused on common descent. I think that was appropriate for this format. There's much more that can be said about natural selection. Some of the alternative mechanisms or ideas, theories that Subboor has mentioned. I think one of them was, sorry, let me just pull up my notes on this part. I think he mentioned mutation-driven evolution and evolution by natural genetic engineering and neo-Lamarckism as examples of this. These are essentially alternate mechanisms, or at least variations on the main mechanism of natural selection that can lead to evolutionary change over time. The main controversy that exists among scientists is, first of all, exactly how important these mechanisms are, and secondly, how really different they are from the current mainstream view. So let me give a quote just to illustrate how this is interpreted within the discipline from Francis Collins. So you may or may not know who he is. He was the director of the Human Genome Project. He's actually a Christian apologist, but he believes in evolution. So he doesn't have at least an atheistic bias. So here's what he said about this. Some scientists today support what is increasingly being called the extended evolutionary synthesis. They challenge the gene-centric idea that variation comes entirely from genetic mutation and that selection merely reflects changes in the frequency of genes. That's sort of the standard view. They claim instead that organisms, not genes, should be the focal point of evolution to better account for how organisms co-construct and co-evolve their environments. On this view, random genetic mutations and natural selection continue to play a vital role in evolution, but so do other factors. While the EES, these new biologists, think these additions to evolutionary theory are sufficiently important to warrant a renaming of the theory itself, like a new synthesis, many other evolutionary biologists disagree. They prefer the name modern synthesis as broad enough to encompass these and other developments in the theory of evolution since Darwin. This label also has a history, but those who use it today usually mean simply that evolution takes place through the central categories of variation and selection. Its proponents are content to allow research into specific mechanism for those who proceed under this label without needing an extension to the theory. Again, none of these groups denies common ancestry, which Subboor has also noted. So that's the end of his quote there. To emphasize that, there was an article published in, I think it was Nature a few years ago as a counterpoint about people saying, scientists saying, we need a new synthesis, and other scientists saying, we don't. No, actually we don't. And some of the scientists are saying, are identifying new phenomena like, a horizontal transfer of genes and epigenetic inheritance and niche construction and so on. Exactly what these things are isn't super important, but they're additional mechanisms that sort of augment or sit alongside natural selection as leading to evolution. Here's what one of the sort of the Con authors said. They said all four phenomena that the authors of the proposition promote are add-ons to the basic processes that produce evolutionary chains: natural selection, drift, mutation, recombination, and gene flow. None of these additions is essential for evolution, but they can alter the process under certain circumstances, end quote. So if you look into the details which of these alternate mechanisms, which I don't have really time to do here, maybe we can get into it a little bit in some of the later discussion, most of them still rely on natural selection. Most of them are mechanisms that generate mutations, so changes, but there still needs to be some way of selecting those that are beneficial or that lead to improved fit between the organism and its environment. Most of them rely on natural selection that way. Some of them don't. Some of them posit additional or sort of additional things that could occur along with natural selection. Many of those, it's unclear how important they are. Like, okay, maybe it happens sometimes, but how often does it happen? And most of the mainstream still maintains the view that natural selection is far and away the most important mechanism, even if, yes, there are some of these additional things on the side. And that's why they don't think we need like a new synthesis, because they don't see these things as fundamentally new. Partly this is a labeling issue, like how different does different have to be for it to be different? Right? I mean, it's kind of a pointless debate in some sense. And honestly, I think part of it comes down to all scientists need funding, and they want their papers to be published in good journals, and they want them to be cited. So every scientist, and I know this from my own limited scientific experience, even as a research assistant, you have to sell your results as being revolutionary, and they're going to change the discipline. Otherwise, the journals you submit the articles will say, this is not impactful enough, and we're not going to publish this. It's not high impact. It's all about impact, and it's all about changing, and it's actually that is a bias that these authors are that these scientists are encouraged to sort of oversell how much their results actually change existing paradigms. So I think that's actually one of the big reasons we see what is, in a sense, a lot of debate about labeling, like how different is different. No one's disputing common descent, and there's some dispute about how central natural selection is as a mechanism, but not really dispute that it is very important. There's some dispute about exactly how very is very, but really I think it's mostly a labeling question here. Okay, so the final point about homoplasy and homology. Now, I mentioned this in my initial remarks. Scientists don't assume homology and then use this to prove common descent. That would, of course, be circular. Scientists observe similarities in genetics and morphology and other things, and then they construct an account about how the organism may have evolved. They test that against further assumptions, like new fossil discoveries, for example, is one common thing, or constructing new phylogenetic trees. If there's sufficient evidence for common descent, and of course this is within the current paradigm of evolution, so generally that's thought to be the case, then traits will be said to be homologous. But that's not an assumption from the outset, and we can talk a bit more about that later. But so that concludes my time. Thank you very much.
So, firstly, the view that you used to hold was the instrumental view, and that's what I read about you online. And then you changed to become a realist.
Well, leaning more towards that.
Leaning more towards that. Okay, so the point which I was making about the instrumentalist view is it's a valid view in the philosophy of science, and it is not a view which is just put forward by people because they don't want to accept certain theories. So the one point that you made, which I do agree with you totally, is that you have to be consistent in science. So if you say, okay, I'm going to be an instrumentalist when it comes to Darwin's theory of evolution, but I'm going to be a realist when it comes to Big Bang, you're going to be cherry picking. So that's something that we can both agree about. But something which you raised, which I think was very, very important, is when philosophers discuss about the realism, anti-realism, and instrumentalism, right? So there's a lot of discussion about this, and one of the things which is recently being put forward is some philosophers putting forward really successful scientific theories which turned out to be false, and even some false models which were much more successful than the models which we now think to be true. So we can obviously not resolve that discussion here. But what do you think, what makes you think that holding the instrumentalist view is, say, less rational, if you believe that, than, say, a realist view?
Right, so I think, so the argument that you're talking about is sometimes called the argument from pessimistic induction. And the idea is, in the history of science, we have lots of theories that were successful to some degree or were widely held, but that have turned out to be false. And so based on sort of the past failures, we should infer that many, or at least some number of our current scientific theories may also turn out to be false, even if we don't know how exactly that will happen. That's the basic idea. I agree there is something to that argument, but I don't think it's as strong as its main proponents say. It's always a question as to, and as you say, I don't want to get into this sort of thing now, but as to like which examples have been chosen, and in terms of the specific theories that are being cited. Are they really scientific theories? I think some of the ones cited are sort of more proto-scientific theories, and I wouldn't necessarily accept them. Yeah, something like phlogiston or vitalism and things like that. But also, there's a question as to, well, what proportion of well-established scientific theories actually turn out to be false? It's not just enough to say that, like, we can cite some examples, but what about all the ones that don't turn out to be? If it's only a small number, then that's not necessarily as strong an argument. But yeah, so we could talk about things like that, but I don't think that would... At the end, I would still acknowledge, yeah, there's something to that argument. But I think that there's also, in my opinion, a stronger argument for scientific realism, which I briefly mentioned before. And it's sometimes called the no miracles argument, which basically says, well, why do scientific theories work so well and allow us to do things and make predictions and use technology and so on? And the idea is either it's like, well, it's a miracle, it's just inexplicable, or it's because the scientific theories actually say something about the way reality really functions. And so we're sort of really getting at something there.
Okay.
And yeah, obviously there's certain steps you have to take to explain, to really flesh out that argument, like any philosophical arguments. But I think that there's quite a lot to that, basically, and that's the main argument that leads me to favour realism.
Okay, so let's take that argument and let's apply that to evolutionary theory. So, say if I am somebody who, and we could just a thought experiment. I'm not saying I believe this, but say I'm somebody who says, okay, the Earth is not 4 billion years old, but 5 billion years old, and there's actually 17 origins of life, or there's 3. And I just change the history of life in some way. An evolutionary biologist who's working in a lab, who's working on, say, trying to discover new antibodies, that's not going to make a difference to what they're doing at all. So a historical reconstruction is not going to change, say, some real life work that they're doing at that particular moment. So when you have a theory which is so broad, then some change in an assumption here, like some change from gradualism to punctuated equilibrium or whatever, from selfish genes to group selection or whatever, multi-level selection, it's not going to make a change in terms of what you're actually doing. That's the first point. The second point is, the no miracles argument that, okay, or that there was, how is it that these things are so successful? That's the way that you can actually counter that, but there's another way you can actually counter that as well, which is if you look at the philosophy of science and you look at the problem of induction and underdetermination of scientific theory by evidence, then when you actually have these results in front of you and you basically look at the history of life and you say, right, only 70%, or let's just say those are proto-science, only say 20% of the scientific theories that we say are really valid, those ones in the past turned out to be false. But then that's also assuming that the ones that we believe in today are actually true. So we can just go back and forth about this, but my main point that I was trying to make is that instrumentalism is a valid position to take in the philosophy of science.
I agree it is, yes.
And it is not something which, you just have to become an instrumentalist because you think that a particular theory challenges your worldview.
No, I wasn't saying that. It's just the only concern is that if people only talk about the instrumentalism with respect to one scientific theory,
I agree.
As if they've got some particular bone to pick with that one, as opposed to making a more broader philosophical point.
Yeah, and the other thing which I wanted to mention before we go into the natural selection and the alternative mechanisms was, do you actually think Darwinism or Darwinian evolution, modern synthesis, whatever you want to call it, do you think it's just another theory in the sense that there's a public misconception about other theories and this theory is just the same, that we have a public misconception? Do you think there's something more in regards to this particular theory? And in terms of what I mentioned about Richard Dawkins, Victor Stenger, Masayoshi Nai, both sides claiming it's a religion. It's quite strange. We don't hear this about the theory of relativity or germ theory or whatever.
There are other scientific theories that have led to a lot of, either recently or historically, a lot of political angst to some degree. Climate change and the science surrounding that is an example. Interestingly, there are some people, there are a lot less of them, there are some people, if you go online, who really, really don't like relativity. I'm not even sure exactly why, but these you know. So, yeah, and there are flat earthers out there. I think they're for reals, but anyways. So I don't, yeah, so in one sense, I don't agree that evolution is completely unique, but clearly, yeah, there are, it's not just any other scientific theory. Since it's been proposed, there have been a lot of people who have reacted strongly to it, for and against, because of often sort of supposed philosophical implications of the theory, which I generally don't necessarily agree with, or at least I don't think it follows straightforwardly from the theory. Yeah, so there is a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot of baggage there about whether people are willing to accept evolution, or even like when it's raised, sort of the associations it has for people. So yeah, no, I agree that there is a bit more to it than that. But I guess I was also emphasizing the other side of it, that the public knowledge of science in general is pretty bad. So I think that that's a big part of it as well.
Sure. And I mean, you scratched on it there, but what I wanted to sort of highlight was, of course, we always get the one-sided view that, okay, there's these religious nutters who are not agreeing with the theory for X, Y, Z. What we don't get is that early, from the very beginning, people who are naturalists, people who are secularists, people who wanted to challenge Christianity, and this is this is discussed by Peter Bowler, by Michael Roos and others, that this was an alternative for them. Darwinism was an alternative to Christianity. Darwinism was an alternative to religion. Julian Huxley, in his Religion Without Revelation and New Bottles for New Wine, he basically made the argument that we must educate the world and turn them into evolutionary humanists, right? And this is a new religion, and this is a new way of life. And he was the first president of the United Nations Scientific, Cultural and Educational Organization. So he was a philosopher and a evolutionary biologist. And so, we should also highlight the fact that on the other side, there's also this type of militant philosophical naturalism, which is pushing the theory way beyond its actual merits. And I think that's what sometimes can create the overreaction from the other side too. I mean, if one side said, do you know what, common descent is fine, it's accepted by the scientists, but what acceptance basically means is based upon this assumption and this assumption and this assumption and this assumption and so on and so forth, but it's a valid scientific theory. The other side wouldn't really put up too much of a fight. But when people go out and say this is absolutely true, and like Richard Dawkins and Victor Stenger said, it's like the shape of the earth, then the other side's going to get to a point where they even deny basic evolution, which was observable before Darwin. So do you think that's the case?
Overreaction. I definitely think that does happen. I certainly don't agree with everything Richard Dawkins says. I certainly don't agree with everything Richard Dawkins or other people like that have said, particularly when it comes to sort of the philosophical implications of Darwinism or of other things. I mean, I'm not, when Darwin says something, not Darwin, when Dawkins says something like evolution allows you to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, I'm not even sure I really agree with that. That would take too long to explain. But the point is, I think that the scientific evidence for Darwinian evolution is very strong, and that provides us with strong reason to believe it is a fact. But I don't necessarily think that there's any clear philosophical implications that follow from this. There may be some, I'm not saying there are literally none, but I think there's a lot more work to be done. I mean, one example we've talked about is there's a very, well, maybe not easy, but there's a quite, at least I would say, intellectually credible way of not believing in evolution in some sense, and that's just being a scientific anti-realist or an instrumentalist. And actually quite a few philosophers are in this position. So, I think that there's just, there absolutely is a tendency to overreact, I think, on both sides, if we want to think of it that way. So, I don't really disagree with that.
Okay, fantastic.
We're about halfway through this discussion, and it's really good we're having that discussion about the context and the implications of the discussion. But as the moderator, I just want to bring it back to the actual topic. So, sitting in the audience, there were slightly two different definitions of facts. Was this definition issue semantical, or do you think that there is one better definition, if you want to use that, and then its relevance to the topic, whether Darwinian evolution is a fact? Anyone want to go first?
Okay, so there's a paper, I'm trying to remember the name, Is Defining Fact the First Problem of Philosophy? This is an ancient paper, like 40, 50 years old. So we're not going to resolve that here. The reason why I chose the definition of fact as being something certain, being absolute, and it's not something that's going to change, is because that is the public perception of the word fact. Not because that is the definition of fact, because I'm aware you can't even define truth. We're going to get into this thing of how do you define this, how do you define that. Definitions is that part of academia that philosophers love and everybody else hates. But some philosophers love. So we're not going to resolve that here. So I don't think James disagrees with me that fact defined that way, Darwinian evolution is not a fact from that perspective. But what's important for us to understand is that there's massive public implications of using words in certain contexts. So when you're going to speak about facts and you're going to speak to the public, then define what you mean. Say, okay, when we are speaking about Darwinian evolution as a fact, we are actually speaking about something which is largely accepted by biologists, which is still based on a probabilistic framework, which has assumptions, and there are disputes about that. There are alternatives about that, which we can go on about later. And this is something which is just the best naturalistic theory you currently have. Just leave it there. But if you just say it's a fact, and you also, you get these sort of slogans that, gravity is a fact like evolution, and then all this sort of the fallacy of equivocation, where you just conflate things, where you show a small, say, change in the evolution of birds or whatever, and then you say, okay, therefore the monad can lead to man. We need to be very, very actually careful about that.
Thanks.
How scientists and or philosophers should express the results of things like scientific research into evolution to the public is a difficult question. I don't know I have a very strong view on this. I think it is okay just for scientists to say that Darwinian evolution is a fact. That said, I do recognize that people in the general public are probably going to interpret it in something like the way you said, and that's not really quite right. Scientists do say, and you do hear them say, even people like Dawkins sometimes say that science is never certain about things and it's always open to revision. There's some differences in what they say at different occasions. I'll grant that. But how much nuance can you have when you're trying to convey basic scientific information to a general audience? I don't know how far you can go. Like if an example that comes to mind is in terms of vaccinations, and actually it's not irrelevant to the topic because how to develop vaccinations is partly informed by evolutionary theory in terms of, even in my own lab that I work in terms of studying the properties of a protein based on looking at similar proteins and sort of constructing an evolutionary tree and how that's going to affect the properties of it. Also antibacterial resistance, which is a slightly different but somewhat related area. So anyway, there are connections. But the point is, if we want to inform the public about, you should get your kids vaccinated because that's going to save lives, and if we say this is based on solid scientific research, but then we say, well, yeah, but actually it's based on a probabilistic framework and it's not 100% certain, then maybe you could be a scientific anti-realist and actually not believe this is, I don't actually think that's going to help. It's just going to confuse people and lead to fewer people vaccinating their children, which is, I don't think, a good outcome. So I'm generally a fan of nuance, and hopefully we've got some of that in this debate, but yeah, I still think it's acceptable in sort of a public scientific education context to say evolution is a fact. Ideally you'd have a bit more of a chance to explain what you mean by that. It's a fact in so much as it's equivalent to other leading scientific theories, I would say. If you accept those as facts, you should accept evolution as a fact. But yeah, it's not a fact in that simplistic sort of absolute certain sense that maybe people have in mind. So this is partly an issue of sort of style and emphasis and communication, which is kind of tricky.
Okay. Yeah. So I think here again we need to, and I disagree with you here. I think we do need to have that nuance because even natural selection has different meanings. So even if you are somebody who doesn't believe in natural selection as being the main primary driver of evolution, you're say a neo-Lamarckist, you would still see in front of you natural selection taking place. Now there's a very trivial understanding of natural selection, which again is pre-Darwinian, that the fittest survive. In terms of bacteria, even if Darwin didn't exist, we would still have that, the idea that the fittest survive. Now, natural selection, the way that Darwin postulated it, wasn't just a simple idea that you have a bunch of organisms and the ones which are the most fit for the environment actually survive. His idea was radically different. His idea was that you can have a massive evolutionary change, and the driver of that change is natural selection. Now, that it would be irrelevant, say, for vaccinations, the second definition of natural selection, which is Darwin's definition. It would be irrelevant because we had vaccinations before Darwin. We actually had vaccinations going back to the Ottoman period and even prior to that. But we do have accounts of, I believe, from the 16th century, where the British ambassador to Ottoman Turkey, actually his wife noted that the Ottomans used to take their kids and used to have these sort of disease parties to get all the kids together and get them all. So this is way before Darwin. So that's not really going to be a problem at all. Now, I do agree with James that there's a big danger of a movement of pseudoscientific behavior, science denial, and all the rest. But I don't think that fear should make us get away from the nuance, because the nuance is very, very important. Because if we're going to speak about science, we need to speak about the philosophy of science. Because if we're not taught the philosophy of science, science won't progress. The very beauty of science is that it changes. That's the very beauty of science. Now, Thomas Kuhn, a famous philosopher and physicist who turned it into a philosopher, he spoke about normal science. When scientists are just working within a paradigm, they're just stuck within a paradigm, and they're just like, they're not thinking outside of that. And then you have these sort of fringe sort of rebellion going on where people are trying to put up these revolutionary ideas, and you have the old guard with its normal science saying, we're not going to give this up. And then over time you get these sort of paradigm shifts, right? So change is good for science, and that change is only going to come when you teach the philosophy of science. When I was at the World Atheist Convention in 2011, Richard Dawkins was giving one of his speeches, and somebody in the audience asked him, should we learn just science, or should we learn the philosophy of science? And he said, don't learn he said, focus on the science, forget the philosophy, right? I think that's very, very dangerous. And, James, I'm happy to hear, doesn't agree with him on many, many points. But the reason why I mentioned him, because I see him at the forefront of this type of militant atheism, which misrepresents science and misuses scientific conclusions to actually widen the gap between the public and the academic understanding.
Cool.
I'm happy to move on to something else.
So we've probably got about a couple minutes in case you wanted to ask questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I guess the question is something like, so there seem to be at least two strands to your argument. One is the more philosophy of science side of things, which is about, what science can deliver and what scientific theories actually say, and the realism, anti-realism stuff, and so on. But then there's at least more science, specifically science-related side, when you say, when you put forward examples of people who are calling for extensions or replacements, or however they phrase it, to the standard neo-Darwinian synthesis, and when you talk about the assumptions behind evolution and some of the other more specific criticisms you've raised. I guess my question is, what do you see as the relationship being between those two strands? Because it seems like they're kind of independent of each other. Like you're sort of saying that, well, even if evolution, the theory of evolution by natural selection was a sort of perfectly pristine, that's not quite the right word, but sort of, as good as it gets scientific theory, we don't necessarily have to believe it in a straightforward way. But also it's not so as pristine as it's made out to be. So what is the connection between those, and what do you think? Because I think I sort of agree more with the philosophy of science side, but I'm not sure I agree with the science side. So yeah, if you just comment on that.
Sure. Okay, thank you for that question. And that's a very important question, because it can be kind of confusing. So you're giving an overall argument from the philosophy of science point of view, and then you're giving scientific examples. So the reason why I do that is because of the priming that we've all had in terms of this sort of excessive belief in science and this sort of scientism. So it's not, I found when discussing any topic in science with the general public, it's not enough to just say, here's the philosophy side of things, here's the problem of induction, here's underdetermination of scientific theory by evidence, or here's this or here's that. Because they have this excessive belief in science because of the way that we actually taught science, and the way that we benefit from technology can also create this sort of thing. So that's why I give the sort of examples that, okay, so even if it was pristine, it wouldn't but it's not because of this and this and this and this. And a prime example, actually, and this is more for, I think, theists than atheists, is the Big Bang model, right? The Big Bang theory. Now, the Big Bang theory is a theory in physics, which is the sort of dominating idea in physics at the moment. Now, before the beginning, before this idea really took off, we had the static state sort of model. We had the sort of model where the universe is eternal. Now, at that particular point, before the Big Bang, say for a theist like a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew, that wouldn't be in line with their holy book, that the universe is eternal. But when the Big Bang came along, then for those theists, it was like, well, hey, we got this. And therefore you find that in religious literature, which is printed, when it's speaking about arguments for God's existence, it says, we know the universe had a beginning because of the Big Bang. That's actually wrong, because we don't know the universe had a beginning because of the Big Bang, because firstly, there's like 17 models. You can have some models in which it doesn't actually have like a beginning. Plus, you can actually have new data which comes along, which challenges the Big Bang, which then replaces it to some sort of model which has no beginning. I've forgotten the name of the physicist, but there's actually a physicist who's recently, I was reading, he's pushing for this idea that the Big Bang is wrong, and he's going back to like some sort of eternal universe. Okay, he's a fringe guy, he's working alone, but in 50, 60 years time, maybe the Big Bang model is going to be thrown out, and the eternal universe sort of type model is going to become prevalent again. So what we need to do is we need to be consistent. We need to have a consistent view in for the philosophy of science. Now I'm just going to speak from the Islamic perspective, that our view for the last 1,000 years, from the beginning of the scientific revolution in Baghdad, was that science is ilm al-dhann, which means knowledge of speculation, right? Which is that you use it as an instrument, you try to use induction, you test, you don't just accept, which is why the method was different to the earlier Greek method, in which it was majority theorizing, so this method was about testing, falsification, not the sort of proper sort of view that, you know, and I've seen a video of yours in which you're speaking against that sort of naive falsification. So not that, but just always understanding this is provisional, but we should continue. But now, with the sort of mantle of the scientific revolution being firmly in the West, Muslims sometimes adopt those assumptions which are not adopted by everyone in the West, of course, but about the sort of scientific realism, that, you know, science does describe reality. So I'm trying to go back to that traditional view that it's actually an instrumental, it's actually an instrument, and the only reasons I give the alternatives, say when it comes to Darwin's theory, is simply to elaborate that nature of science.
Awesome. Quick response, or?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So we're going to move on to Q&A. So we still have the concluding remarks right at the end. But I'm going to put my number up on the screen. As I'm doing that, I'm going to ask you both a question that, from experience, is asked at most debates. What would you need to be exposed to, or what evidence would need to be put forth, or which argument must be made for you to change your mind on the topic of today's debate? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. Let's see. So, what would I need to hear or sort of see to change my mind? Well, I guess there's two aspects to that. Strong arguments against scientific realism would be one. That's the more sort of philosophical side of it. Yeah, that's probably an easier thing to deliver, of course, because there are a lot of philosophers who argue about this. So that's something that, you know, is an ongoing journey. But yeah, personally, I don't think any of the arguments are really super definitive one way or the other. I just sort of, yeah, I think the no miracles argument does get at something. In terms of the more scientific side of it, that's a bit harder, because I think that it is one of the key aspects of a scientific theory that Subboor just alluded to, is that it does have to be falsifiable, not in a very simplistic sense, like, well, one new observation could just undermine everything and we'd change our minds overnight. But there does have to be the possibility that new observations could come to light that would prove it to be wrong. If there's no possibility that it could, then it's not really a scientific theory. So yeah, there are such possibilities that could come to light. So I mean, one example that's sort of sometimes said is like the human fossils found in the Precambrian, which is a very ancient period of the geological time span, basically hundreds of millions of years ago, long before humans evolved. If we found bona fide human fossils there, that would, in itself, I don't think it would falsify evolution, but that would be a really big problem. And if we found a few more things like that, big holes in the phylogenetic tree, in the trees that just weren't mapping at all to the fossils, if we found huge problems with that we couldn't resolve in terms of the mechanisms of natural selection being unable to account for particular adaptations, systematically, then these sorts of things would seriously undermine my confidence in evolution and Darwinian evolution. And then I wouldn't say that I think we have enough confidence and evidence to say that it's a fact. I would say, well, maybe not. So yeah, those are some of the sorts of things. Obviously, there are other possibilities. I don't think that any of those things have been observed, and I don't think they will be. But if they were, then that would get me to seriously reconsider my views.
Okay, so in regards to that question, in terms of science, I find it very difficult to see how I would change my mind in terms of its conclusions, leaning more towards realism, because of the problem of induction and underdetermination and the history. But I would say, in terms of Darwinian evolution being true, if I was a naturalist, if I was somebody that actually believed that there was no God, nature is all that there actually is, then the science would actually be irrelevant, because something like a Darwinian history of life and some sort of naturalistic mechanism would be true by default. So if I was a naturalist, the science would be irrelevant anyway, because I'd simply have that as my backdrop. So keeping that in mind, anything I see, it will basically be evidence for some sort of Darwinian history. Now, it's good that James brought up the issue of falsification again. So a good example is the famous philosopher from Australia, David Stove. He wrote a book called Darwinian Fairy Tales. And in this book, he laments about, that Darwinists see, and he's talking about militant Darwinists here, they see human behavior as something which is explained by natural selection. So why do we go out to work? Because we're trying to survive and reproduce. Why do we get married? Because we're trying to survive and reproduce. But then he points out other things. He says, why do we build hospitals? That's the survival of the unfittest. Why do we help out people that we're not related to? Darwinists would say, well, it's kin selection. It's you helping out your kin, or it's basically reciprocal altruism. So you're helping out somebody because they can help you out in the future. And then the reply to that obviously is, well, why do you help people that you're not kin with and you're not actually going to benefit from them? Say an old person that's dying that's not going to benefit you in any way. What I've read, the Darwinists replied to that, well, natural selection was making us help our kin, but as a shortcut, what natural selection started to do is just help those people around us. And since it started helping those people around us, there was this type of runaway mechanism in which we just started helping people around us. Now, somebody else can turn around and say, well, if that is the case, then how would you know if that isn't the case? It just sounds like you're just covering all bases. And then the question really arises, which, I could ask James, or I could ask someone who believes in natural selection explaining human behavior. What type of behavior is non-Darwinian? Because, as David Stove points out, it's nothing. There is no even hypothetical type of behavior, let alone things we've observed, which cannot be explained by just those stories. Right? So in terms of changing my mind, in terms of the science side of things, I don't see how I would do that. But in terms of Darwinian evolution being true, I would actually have to be a naturalist, in which case everything would be evidence, regardless of what it actually is.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is, on that screen, I'm going to put like a 2-minute timer so we can churn through the questions. First one.
Maybe 1 minute, because we're going to have loads of questions,
okay,
right?
Sure. I'll fix that as we go. So the first question that's coming in is for Subboor. So the question, are the philosophical restrictions to science, namely induction, etc., also restrictions that limit religion's knowledge? For example, do we apply reason only to that which we observe? Can we be 100% sure or true that the Quran legitimately the true legitimacy of the Quran at the threshold which surpasses knowledge science gives?
Okay. That's a very good question, and this question has actually been discussed by Muslims throughout the generations. Imam Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, others, hundreds of years ago. Lots of discussion about religion, revelation. That's not something I can go into in too much detail. But as Muslims, we don't believe in just one route of knowledge. We believe in multiple routes of knowledge. So we believe in reason, we believe in empirical data, we believe in self-evident truths. We believe some things are true, and it's not that you have to actually prove them to be true. So we believe morals are like that. We believe even the existence of God is a self-evident truth. Maths and logic is what science is based upon, but it's not something obviously that science can prove. Introspection, testimony. Testimony is a valid source of knowledge. This is something in the Islamic epistemology, that we believe testimony is a valid source of knowledge. Of course, there's ways that you actually verify it. And in Islam, we have this term, which we call the fitra, which is known as the natural inclination, which is like an inner voice, which is like this sort of spiritual connection that we can have with God. So we believe these are all different routes of knowledge, and that with that view, I've run out of time, with that view, pointing out the problem of induction doesn't make us into global skeptics of any sort.
Awesome. Murad, can you stop spamming my phone, please? Okay, just to balance things out.
I think the lady's putting her hand up.
My question is to the both of you. I see that religion mostly uses theology and philosophy, but it does use almost every other part of knowledge. For example, even science is a supporting argument. And science, on the other hand, although it does use data and observation, and in some parts even philosophy as a supporting argument, both of them, we could argue, is kind of uncertain. Like we say that facts and observations and data that are collected are not certain, so we can't draw the conclusion that the evolutionary theory is certain, or that is how it all started. On the other hand, one could argue that, well, how can you say that God is certain and that God created everything? But that's an argument that would come on both sides. Like, one could argue that what is your argument for God creating everything? The same way someone could say that how can you say that the evolutionary theory is the beginning of everything? So how do we, as people that are learning all of these things and want to come to that conclusion, make a decision? Because there's no solid decision you can make. There's no there's no evidence that you could literally grab that is tangible, that you could say that this proves the beginning of everything. How do we arrive at the conclusion and make the decision that this is the better, or this is the truth and this is how it all started? How do we get to that point? How do we choose between Darwinism as a religion or Islam or anything else as a religion? That's my question to both of you.
Yeah, I can go first. Wow, that's like the question in some sense. I mean, and 1 minute to answer it. Wow. Okay, so I'll just sort of offer a few insights and we'll see if that's helpful. So there's a position in philosophy called fallibilism, and I'm quite partial to it. It's the idea that you can know things without being certain. That is, that there's you can still legitimately know something, but there's still a possibility that you could be wrong. And I mean, scientists generally adopt this without necessarily knowing it. So I think that's a critical idea, that it's not like either we know something for certain or we don't know it at all, and knowledge can be fallible. Another issue is that I think what we should try to do in looking at the world and trying to make sense of it is look at a broad range of things. So not just scientific observations, but philosophical debates and our interactions with other people and so on, and consider all of that. And while we sort of try to make sense of it, we construct what was sometimes called a worldview. This is a system of ideas and theories and knowledge and so on that tries to make sense of things. Clearly, Subboor and I come from different worldviews. I'm inclined to sort of atheistic naturalism. Obviously, Subboor is a Muslim, and as such, that has strong effects on how he interprets scientific evidence and so forth. There's a lot to be said about how we go about trying to fit our worldview to things we observe, but I think it's a sort of holistic, iterative process. It's not like there's one thing that you do and that gets you there. It's a very integrative process, and it's complicated. Sorry, not a very helpful answer.
Stop. So, thank you for that question. My question, to answer it, has become easier because I pretty much agree with James. It's not, you just don't have to do anything. You don't have to do everything. When it comes to science, now science, the way that, the Muslims have always understood it in the past, it's a way of actually understanding God's nature as well. And this is pointed out in the Quran by reflecting, by thinking, by doing these sort of things. And again, I agree with James that, you have to look at the world from a holistic point of view. You have to look at, philosophical arguments, scientific arguments. You have to look at even sometimes introspection. I mean, things like morals drive us. You can't philosophically prove them. You can't scientifically observe them. But they literally drive us. That is the driver of human behavior. If you take morals out, you just get like dead zombies, right? So there's a whole way of looking at the world. The only difference between me and him in terms of looking at the world, in terms of epistemology, I'm sure he'd agree with me, is we both believe in self-evident truths, maths and logic, introspection, testimony, reason, using science and philosophy. The difference as a Muslim would be the fitrah, which is that there is an innate disposition in a human being to be inclined towards God. That would be the difference in our epistemology. Apart from that, we would agree on pretty much everything.
Okay, it's possible. Other than human evolution, does evolution and natural selection contradict Islam?
Well, it's actually a much easier question. I've had this a few times before. So firstly, human evolution, we need to define it in different ways, right? So when it comes to human beings evolving, like our skin color changing due to geographical distribution, or us getting a mutation which allows us to survive, say, malaria, this is a type of evolution. We're not going to deny that. Now, to single out human evolution and say that human evolution in terms of human chimpanzee history is not true, but human evolution in terms of everything else is true in terms of all the rest of life, that would be cherry picking. The Islamic view is very, very simple, which is that we accept all the science as valid science. We don't accept it to be literally true. The creation of, say, organisms like did the whale have some sort of land terrestrial sort of ancestor? As Muslims, we can't say yes and we can't say no. We can't say either way. But I do have other videos in which I just describe this in much more detail. I'm just going to plug my channel, Darwinian Delusions.
James, do you want to plug your blog?
Well, I'll plug my blog and my podcast if that's not too bold. So I have a podcast called the Science of Everything podcast. I basically just talk about a variety of scientific topics. So if that's the sort of thing you're interested in, you can just Google that, the Science of Everything. The other thing is, my blog, it's called The Godless Theist. Not the godless atheist, the godless theist. So it's a deliberate contradiction, right? That's sort of the point. Anyway, I write about a variety of topics there, and I think I'll put some notes up about tonight's event, so that'll be interesting. And again, if you're interested in these sorts of reflections and discussions, you can check that out.
Nice.
Okay.
I'd say when I was going through high school, you taught theory of evolution, but you also taught neo-Lamarckism, and you taught that neo-Lamarckism is kind of old and it's not relevant. And we're heading towards, theory of evolution and stuff. But apparently, you guys can actually basically the question is apparently due to new studies that neo-Lamarckism could potentially maybe come back. What's your opinion to that? Would you be able to incorporate that into the theory of evolution, or do you think that it's completely rubbish?
I'm assuming that's for James?
Both.
For both? Okay. Who wants to go first?
Maybe I can. So, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, that part of Lamarckian evolution, that's making a comeback. And that's making a comeback because, there's been studies done, I think 2010, 2011 onwards, that were like, really showing that you can actually acquire characteristics which are then passed on to your offspring. Now, what's interesting about this is that Darwin wasn't against the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He actually thought it was possible, and he wasn't, the way Lamarck was sort of mocked, after him, he wouldn't really even agree with that. So I would say Darwin would say acquired characteristics can be incorporated within the theory of natural selection. Now, later on, when neo-Lamarckism took off, people like Eva Jablanka and others, I think her book is called Transformations of Lamarckism, they were putting forward the argument which was radical, which is what they pushed forward at the Royal Society, which is it's not going to be a part of your extended synthesis. It's not going to be just an extension to the modern synthesis. It is going to be an alternative. So you have both camps which actually exist. You have those that want to say that, I think James quoted him, Massimo Palatini Palmari, I think he's the guy who he quoted, who said we can make it a part of the extended synthesis. Then there's others who are saying we're not going to do that.
Yeah, this is still an open question. There's so many issues here. I agree, inheritance of acquired characteristics, which was one of Lamarck's key ideas, has been demonstrated. There's a big dispute as to how often does it occur. It's been demonstrated in some contexts. I would say it's far and away from being shown that it's a major driving factor in evolution. The main mechanism by which it occurs is called through epigenetics, which is essentially modifications to the DNA in terms of how it's expressed, and putting it very crudely. Most evolutionary biologists do not regard this as like overturning evolution or really as neo-Lamarckian. Partly this is a labeling thing. Lamarck thought that it wasn't just that you could inherit characteristics that were acquired, but it's that characteristics that were acquired or changed through use. Like the giraffe, the classic example, the giraffe stretches its neck trying to reach the higher branches, and that sort of acquired characteristic through the use of its neck was passed on to its offspring. That form of acquired characteristic has not been demonstrated. It's not quite the same as what Lamarck said. So there's some disputes as to how accurate the labeling is. There's disputes about how important it is, and there's disputes as to how it should be incorporated into the existing synthesis or whether it's a new thing. So yeah, I tend to think that that's a little bit overblown by people wanting their research to be sort of more than it is, but yeah, that's a bit subjective. It's complicated.
It's complicated.
Okay, given the time and the fact that we're aiming to finish by 8 and we still have the summaries to go, we're probably going to take 2 or 3 final questions. Because there's some text ones, we could probably get maybe you guys to answer them because they're in writing later. But we'll probably prioritize the questions from the floor. So we'll go 1, 2, and 3, and then we'll have our summaries, okay? So go ahead.
I don't need much. Thanks for your talks. Since it seems like this debate was created because of the perceived incompatibility between evolution and religion, but in fact, in my view, the incompatibilities between evolution and pre-modern interpretations of religion, I'm going to approach my question from an Islamic standpoint, one that comes from within the dogma of Islam, and therefore my question is directed to Subboor. Now, reading the Quran, you can actually see that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam uses the same techniques to show the existence of a creator as the techniques used to prove evolution. For example, if you go to Surah Yasin, you see a token to them is a dead earth. We revive it and we bring forth from it grain so that they eat thereof, and so on and so forth. We see that the Quran is showing it, like it's creating predictions. If you regard the text of the Quran as a theory, just like evolution, it's also producing predictions, and we're seeing the consistency of these predictions with the world around us. But it seems that you don't accept this technique when it's applied to evolution, but you do when it's applied to Islam. And furthermore, you demand from those who accept evolution for a mechanism for natural selection. But in fact, medieval Muslim scholars could never provide an evidence-based mechanism for some of the fundamental concepts of Islam. For example, nubuwwat, like the concept of prophethood, rusulat, the concept of having something sent down, like tanzil, or they couldn't even provide an evidence-based mechanism for the continued existence of God that didn't come from Aristotelian arguments involving the prime movers. So I just want to, it seems a bit hypocritical to me that you're applying such rigor to the theories in science, but that rigor doesn't really apply when it comes to Islam and the Quran.
Okay. Did you get all of that?
Yeah. There's a simple way of addressing that, and that this is not something which is new. This has been discussed previously, and I would just point out a few things. Like, I think what you've done is you've done some very basic reading, and I think that you've confused a few things. So firstly, the Prophet, peace be upon him, never set out to prove the existence of God. Islamic theology across the spectrum has always said that the belief in God is because of the fitrah, because of the innate disposition. So that's not there. The other thing is that if you did a bit more reading on that, you would know people have taken it much further than you. People have actually used the Quran, used certain verses to prove evolution before Darwin, right? If you did your research, you would know that there were people like not Ibn Khaldun, I've forgotten the name, but there's actually people way before. In fact, John William Draper, in his book, when he was speaking about Darwin's theory of evolution, before Darwin, he actually called one of the theories in the Muslim lands the Muhammadan theory of evolution. This is the Victorian times, right? Sorry? Ibn Khaldun as well. Now, what it is if you want to agree with somebody, then you should go into that camp and say, okay, we agree with them because of this, right? Now, even their reasoning, if you actually look at it, it wasn't actually to do with science. It was actually to do with the Quran. They said that we believe in this because of the Quran. Now, that interpretation was challenged by the vast majority for other reasons. They said this is false because of this particular thing, and I'm part of the other camp. So, in terms of not accepting some of it and accepting the rest, from 1,000 years ago, from the time of Ibn Haytham, who is known as the father of the modern scientific method, he believed in it and I believe in it, and the Muslims across the spectrum have believed in science being an instrument, but an instrument which is there to bring you closer to God, but still a knowledge which is at best fallible, which is not something which is uncontroversial in philosophical circles.
Okay, because of that question, I'm going to cut it down to one question. So it's between Muhammad and Muhammad. We'll just do scissors, paper. So ready? On 3, scissors, paper. So do a hand gesture.
Is there about to be a fight?
Someone ask a question.
Okay.
So the question is Subboor.
Yeah.
I think the crux of where Muslim youth at least feel like, to accept or not to accept evolution, that is the question. Anyway, so basically, why is your faith in the Islamic tradition and its lack of deficiency, so to speak, greater than your faith in the scientific method? So you said science has these deficiencies, so I have less faith in it than this. So why is your faith in the dominant interpretation of religious tradition greater than science? So would you contend that there are no mirror deficiency from science to religion, like this of similar value?
Okay.
Yeah.
Great question from the man with the topic.
Okay, so firstly, I think it's a false dichotomy to say faith in science and faith in the Quran or faith in this, right? Because Islamically, we're taught in terms of our epistemology that science, reason, philosophy, different ways of looking at the world are valid. So there's not, faith in science and faith in philosophy. If I existed 100 years ago, I would still hold the same view in the philosophy of science that I hold today. So it's not that we've discovered something in science which has made 1,300 years of Islamic scholarship do a U-turn and become from scientific realists into scientific instrumentalists. No, this is the view I would have held even if I existed at the time that the Big Bang model was not there and you had the eternal state sort of theory or static state theory, or say the time of Imam Ghazali or the time of Ibn Taymiyyah or these guys. So that view has been consistent throughout. The only thing I've done here is point out examples, right? There's been nothing absolutely controversial about that. So this pitch between science versus religion, this is actually, it started off in the Victorian times, and because of colonization, it then spread to the Muslim countries, where it was like, okay, we had really bad experience with religion, and they were holding back scientists and they were burning them. Therefore, you guys should also understand that this war between science and religion should basically have science winning. And even Muslims who come, like I'm originally from Pakistan, all of our system is based upon the British system, and so we've adopted those assumptions that science and religion don't go hand in hand. When what's very important to understand is even the Muslim scientists who were known as heretical, who used to propose that human beings evolved from ape-like creatures, or they evolved from whatever, right? None of them were burnt to the stake. None of them were persecuted. You even had some theologians who basically used to say things which were completely against the Quran. They used to say the universe is eternal and so on and so forth. No one was burnt to the stake. So this whole science versus religion thing is not ours. It's not our battle, and it's never been our issue.
Awesome. So just to reiterate and emphasize a very important point, we are out of time for Q&A at the moment, but you're more than free to come down. I know both of you guys might be a little bit jet lagged to varying degrees, but you guys can come down after the debate and ask these questions in person, and then that will give you a better opportunity without the 1 minute limit or anything like that. So last concluding remarks, 2 minutes each.
He hasn't been able to speak for like 10 minutes. So
You want to go first?
you start.
Oh, well, I think we should stick with the order that
Okay,
we're
Sure.
doing. Yeah.
no problem.
You're fine with questions afterwards as well?
Yeah, that's fine. I can hang around for a bit.
Awesome.
Yep. In terms of everything that we've said, there's been a lot of repetition of the sort of key sort of concepts that, you know, whether science is an instrument, whether it's something that leads to truth, you know, truth literally or whatnot. But fundamentally, this really breaks down to your epistemology, what you actually believe about the world, what you actually believe is the roots of knowledge. And that is something which generally as a topic is lacking in the world, and especially in terms of young Muslims, that's also something which is lacking, which is understanding what is your epistemology, how do you know truth, how do you know, okay, whether we should accept something to be literally true or provisionally true. And that is the thing which is going to resolve many of these issues. The other thing is that it's important when we are speaking about scientific arguments or scientific evidence or issues that come up, is always you need to understand that science is not something which we should see as a threat. Even if there's a scientific theory which goes against your religious views, whether it's something about the universe, something about the soul, or something about whatever, something in neuroscience, it doesn't mean that you should become like a anti-science person who rejects science. No, accept it as a working model theory paradigm. Work within that paradigm. Work with the Quranic paradigm that if you save one life, you save the lives of all of humanity, and contribute to humanity. Don't fall into this science versus religion battle.
Awesome. Time to spare as well.
Right, so I just want to thank the Society here again for hosting me and for inviting me to discuss this topic, and I think it was a good exchange. I think that just to, one thing that I would like to briefly discuss, briefly mention is this idea of altruism in evolution, which was Subboor mentioned a couple of times and I sort of never got to address, and I think it might be a good way of just concluding. So there are some people who seem to think, or even explicitly think, that Darwinian's theory of natural selection should sort of explain like literally everything in biology, including all human behaviors. And I think this is false, and I think that this is overreaching. I think Darwin's theory of natural selection explains an awful lot, but it doesn't explain absolutely everything. In particular, human cultural behaviors, not all of those are selected for. You know, like the behavior of engaging in a debate about an academic subject, I don't think was the subject of selective pressures in our environment of evolutionary adaptation. I think that's taking it too far. And a lot of evolutionary biologists would agree with that. This is sometimes called hyper-adaptationalism, the idea that everything has to be an adaptation. So I don't necessarily think that all altruistic behaviors or other sorts of behaviors were selected for, and that's an example of something that was sort of mentioned earlier, and this is sort of taking a what I think is a valid and very solid scientific theory and pushing it too far. And there can be reasons for this, because people have their own pet scientific projects, or because people have their own pet philosophical ideas that they want to promote. But we should be wary of this. I think that we should understand the science and have a good knowledge of what it says, and also what it doesn't say. And also, I agree with the idea of thinking about epistemology and philosophy of science and taking these seriously. I don't agree with when people like Dawkins and Hawking and so on have said that we should ignore philosophy and it doesn't have anything useful to say. I think that's wrong. I think there are very persuasive evidences in favour of Darwinian evolution by natural selection. At the end of the day, that whether you sort of accept these as describing reality or as sort of a working model is going to be dependent on your underlying epistemology. And yes, I think that that's about as good as we can get in an event like this. So thanks again, everyone, and it's been a pleasure.